Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with David McPherson. David is a philosopher. He's also a professor. He is a philosopher in the works with the areas of ethics, particularly virtue ethics, along with political philosophy, meaning in life, and philosophy of religion. He is the author of a few books. Previous book, Virtue and Meaning, and then his most recent book, The Virtue of Limits, which is the book that we get into in this conversation. We talk about the limiting virtues. We talk about the origins of virtues and some of the two stances he describes. We talk about the difference between virtues and values. We give the example of reverence. We talk about the importance of worldviews. We spend quite a bit of time on Nietzsche and Nietzsche on values. I have to say we sort of get bogged down a little bit on. We have a difference of opinion on our reading of Nietzsche, as you'll see in the conversation. It was very enjoyable for me, and I think for him as well, mostly because we have differences of opinion on Nietzsche, and so it was really cool to kind of give different perspectives and try and see where things were at the bottom of it. And so it was a really nice bit of the conversation. We talk about authenticity. We talk about political and economic limits. And then we end towards the end of the conversation, we talk about a type of healthy nationalism. I talk a little bit about what I mean by that and some of my writing on that. And he talks about some of his ideas about patriotism and some idea of having a Sabbath and things like that, and so what does these things mean for our collective culture and many other topics. And so I really enjoyed the conversation with David, as is true for most people that come on and they study philosophy. I just have a fantastic time. It's just kind of picking and pulling and pushing ideas and trying to figure it out kind of in real time, and it's such a delight. And so now I bring you David McPherson. I'm here with David McPherson. David, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Xavier. I appreciate you having me on.
Of course, yeah. I was really interested. I think I came across. I think it was online, I think is what it was. I came across your book. I think I saw a few people tweeting about it and posting about it. The book is called The Virtues of Limits, and it's fantastic. It's a very good book. So just tell folks who you are and about the book and why you decided to write it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I teach philosophy. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. Although this year, my family and I are in Colorado. I have a sabbatical fellowship at CU Boulder, and so we're living in Colorado. My wife and our 4 children, so we're having some adventures out here. So this book emerged. So I wrote a previous book called Virtue and Meaning, a Neo-Aristotelian Perspective, that came out in 2020 with Cambridge University Press. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of my my sort of broad approach to virtue ethics. I was somewhat dissatisfied with some of the common accounts among virtue ethicists. And so that was sort of my broad account. But I've been thinking for a while, partly because I teach biomedical ethics, I've been thinking a lot about the sort of place of limits in human life. This was a theme that had kind of cropped up in my teaching and in my reading. I've also been a fan of, certain people I've been drawn to. This is a theme I've seen sort of in their work. So, one person I discussed towards the end of the book is the agrarian essayist Wendell Berry, and the theme of limits is very prominent in his work. And so it's just sort of this theme I was kind of coalescing around. And, I kind of wanted to put together a sort of broader socio-political, moral vision. So, I'm working in the Aristotelian tradition, and Aristotle had his ethics, and then he had his politics. In some way, this book is not entirely political, though there's a chapter on political limits. In some ways, it's my attempt to kind of build out a fuller kind of life vision of my approach to virtue ethics. And so that was kind of a big part of the motivation in writing the book. Is I think any ethical framework, especially if you're an Aristotelian, has to be connected up with a sort of broader vision of life. And so this is a key part of kind of working out that broader vision of life. And so it's actually a pretty short book. I think in keeping with with the theme of limits, I kind of structured it around these four kinds of limits. I call them existential limits, moral limits, political limits, and economic limits. So that helped to constrain the book, that it's a sort of 4-chapter book looking at each of these kinds of limits in human life and sort of the virtues that help us to properly acknowledge limits in those domains.
Yeah, no, I think you definitely sum it up really well. I guess just one question before we get into the limits is, you're in philosophy. Is there a particular branch of philosophy that you, in terms of certain thinkers or certain things? I know you mentioned, I think, the bioethics, I think you mentioned. But is there any, are you kind of a Aristotelian, or are you really into Rousseau or things like, some people kind of stake a claim with, a certain, they're German idealist and they love, talking about those group of guys, or certain philosophers. Is there anyone, or are you just more of a generalist, or how do you kind of usually fit in terms of, I guess, philosophy proper within the canon?
Yeah, and sort of briefly indicated there, but definitely, I see myself in the Aristotelian tradition of philosophy. So I would say my main area is in ethics, particularly virtue ethics, but I'm also interested in political philosophy, also kind of questions of the meaning of life, sort of a contemporary way to, I think, get at what Aristotle was talking about when he talked about the, seeking the ultimate end of life. What's it all about? And so my previous book, Virtue and Meaning, kind of connected up virtue ethics with questions of meaning in life, but also philosophy of religion. So I'm actually currently working on my third monograph right now, which is called Spiritual Alienation and the Quest for God. So that'll be looking more specifically at sort of our spiritual condition and trying to work that out. So I see myself broadly, kind of within the ancient tradition of philosophy as a way of life. So where philosophy is trying to develop a holistic vision of life, something that could enable us to live well, understand seeking wisdom and sort of that sense of the ancient sense of holistic understanding that really is only properly realized when you actually live it out. And so I see my work as kind of within that tradition, but trying to, I'd say the guiding question in my research is, what is it to live well as human beings in the conditions in which we find ourselves? And those conditions are both perennial, things that are just sort of always with us, part of, what we might call the human condition, but they're also modern, I would say. So this sort of modern condition, or our contemporary condition. So a lot of my work tries to both look at, what's perennial here and what's also modern. And a philosophy that's been particularly influential for me, who's sort of taken this approach, is Charles Taylor, for instance, in his book, Sources of the Self, kind of looks at this perennial aspect, but also this, what's distinctive of our modern condition. So, so my work tries to do that as well. So for instance, this book, The Virtues of Limits, is responding to something that I think is a perennial tension in human life, which is that, we achieve what's best in our humanity by transcending limits, but also without properly recognizing certain limits, we can also become dehumanized. We can fail to achieve our human good. And there's been this tendency towards, what I call the Promethean ideal, or Prometheanism, which is a kind of attempt to achieve mastery over the world, a kind of playing God. Now, that's always been with us. And of course, the story of Prometheus goes back to the ancient Greek myth. And you see it in other traditions like the Tower of Babel and the Hebrew Bible. But I think it's especially become very prominent within the modern world. I think the modern project, in some ways, from Descartes and Francis Bacon onward, is this sort of project of mastery. And so some of that's been very good, but I think it's also problematic in a number of ways. So it's this area of a kind of tension in human life that's both perennial and modern, that it seems worth really trying to kind of come to terms with and make sense of, and figure out how we can live best in both the human condition as it is perennial, and also in its modern form. So
Mm.
So I mean, that's kind of generally how I see my work. The previous book on virtue and meaning dealt with the problem of disenchantment, or the sense of a threat, the loss of meaning and value that I think a lot of contemporary Neo-Aristotelians were trying to respond to when they were criticizing, these views that said you couldn't derive an ought from an is, or value from facts about the world. They're trying to give some sense of natural normativity. But I thought they were still too disenchanted. So that was sort of a project of re-enchantment. And so, yeah, I think in a similar way with this book I'm working on now, it's dealing with the problem of alienation as both something that's a perennial feature of the human condition that, for instance, you see expressed in the story of the Garden of Eden, but also it's something that I think has been exacerbated within the conditions of modernity. And so, yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of my work tries to, it's big in scope, but it tries to come to terms and sort of offer a broad vision of life within this philosophy as a way of life kind of approach.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I haven't talked about Aristotle properly on the podcast too much. I usually defer to my good friend Stephen Klaus. He's the man for all things Aristotle, at least in my world. So I'm sure you guys would have a really fun chat. He loves Aristotle. So let's you've already mentioned it. You've talked about the four limits here. Existential, where you go over the Promethean aspects, the moral, political, and economic. But I believe there are 6, if I'm not mistaken. So what are the other 2, and why did you choose to focus on these 4 for the book, and kind of expand on these elements?
Yeah. So actually, perhaps a little confusing. So there's 6 what I call limiting virtues that I look at with respect to these 4 kinds of limits. So again, the 4 kinds of limits: existential, moral, political, and economic. The 6 what I call limiting virtues are humility, reverence, contentment, moderation, loyalty, and neighborliness. I'm sure we'll talk about each of those in due course here. But so I one of the kind of key original ideas is just this idea of the limiting virtues. So the title of the book, The Virtues of Limits, is meant to have a kind of double, I would say it has a double meaning. One, you might think of the virtues of something as like the excellence of it, or the benefits associated with it. So there's benefits of limits, or there's excellences of limits. But also the virtues of limits is meant to also convey this idea of the limiting virtues, those virtues that are particularly concerned with properly recognizing limits in human life. Now, I actually think all the virtues recognize limits in human life. They recognize some, insofar as there's something we ought to be concerned about. So take like generosity. Generosity is not a limiting virtue in the sense I'm thinking about it, but that generosity is an excellence it places constraints on us. So we ought to be concerned with having the virtue of generosity. It's a restraint in our desire, in our choices. So if we want to achieve that excellence, that and the nobility that comes with that, then I think we see it as restraining us. But the limiting virtues that I want to focus on they're more specifically concerned in each of these 4 domains: the existential, moral, political, and economic. So just to begin with one, I think, which I call the master limiting virtue, is humility. I think humility is sort of the key limiting virtue, because it recognizes our proper place in the scheme of things. It recognizes that some things must be accepted as given and not shaped, or controlled. So it poses a kind of limit on a certain controlling posture towards the world. And so I think it's really the virtue that properly, I mean, in the broadest sense, properly acknowledges limits. For instance, our personal limitations, our natural limitations, recognizing that we're situated. A traditional way of putting it is that we're situated between the beast and the divine. That we're not God, but we're also not. The beast is like a non-rational animal. That we have a special kind of dignity. So humility is not the same thing as a kind of self-abasement. So there's been a number of philosophers like David Hume that have seen humility as just a kind of self-abasement. Rather, I think humility has to be paired with proper magnanimity. I mean, this is something St. Thomas Aquinas talked about, is that humility is paired with magnanimity. So we both recognize our potential for greatness, but also that we have these limits that are a part of our humanity. And so that's really the key limiting virtue in my view. And I see it closely connected with reverence, but we can get more into that as we go forward. But
I guess you talk about it in the book, and I guess one thing that I'm curious about here is what are the origins of these limits here? So you're talking about, so we'll stay with humility for a minute, right? So with this virtue, with this virtue, where is I guess you could say, what's the etiology of this, right? Is this a human thing? And how absolute is this, right? Because I think that in terms of defining the terms, that could be very much, if you take a Judeo-Christian or even any religious kind of context here, many people say, well, yes, comes down from on high. This is from the supreme being, the deity, etc., whatever. These are the things we should, ascribe to, etc., right? And so that's an easy out, right? That's fine. And people will use that, and that's okay, right? But I guess taking a kind of a humanistic approach, right? Which is, if we're taking out a deity or whatever, where do we see humility originating from? Why would it be needed or necessary? And how is it, if it is, universal and not relative necessarily?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, it is a contested virtue, to be sure. I mean, I think Aristotle himself, he talked a lot about magnanimity, but he was not, he didn't really have a term for, he didn't have any great discussions of humility, but what we might recognize as humility as a virtue, he wouldn't have recognized. So the magnanimous person doesn't want to acknowledge their dependency upon others, right? So they don't want any kind of acknowledged dependence. This is a term that the philosopher Alistair McIntyre uses in a book called Dependent Rational Animals. And so, and that's something he criticizes Aristotle for. But nevertheless, I think in Greek culture, you see this concern with hubris or sort of vicious pride. And there's a book by Paul Woodruff called Reverence, Renewing a Forgotten Virtue, which I discuss, somewhat critically in the sense of, I think he conflates reverence and humility, but they are closely linked virtues. He thinks of reverence as a virtue concerned with not trying to act like gods. Now, I think that's actually part of the virtue of humility. And he like Hume, sort of understands humility in negative terms. Now, it is true, I think, within, the Jewish and Christian traditions, I think you have humility is a virtue that's clearly recognized and, is a central virtue, especially in relation to God. And even the way I characterize it, sort of a traditional way of thinking about it, is situated between the beast and the divine, has a kind of religious connotation. Then so too does reverence, right? I'm beginning really from, a kind of, I think the only way to begin the ethical life is sort of within it, from our experience of the world and what makes sense to us. And so I think these are terms. I mean, there's been increased interest recently in humility, including among secular philosophers, different ways of thinking about it, the role of humility in public life and the sort of problems of arrogance and, claims to be self-made, that we have so much self-importance. All those seem to be things that humility is concerned to address. And so I think it can be seen as a virtue, that anyone can recognize and should recognize. And I seek to make the argument for that. But I don't think ultimately the virtues can be worldview neutral. I mean, I think, this is sort of a broader question of how do you go about arguing for ethical positions. I think part of what you try to do is say, well, this is what happens if you don't have humility. This is what the world looks like if you don't have humility. And so the way I make my arguments begin with these two basic, what I call existential stances or orientations towards the given world. Mm-hmm. The given world is just like what we've, the world we find ourselves in that we haven't chosen. It's just there. It's the world around us. It's our own our own humanity. That's the world as it were given to us, right? Now again, we don't necessarily need to put too much into the language of given, because that, obviously that could have connotations of given by God, but just a sense of what exists, right?
Sure.
That's why it's an existential stance. It's a stance towards what exists, right?
I think of usually in my mind one of the world the different types of world that Heidegger talks about. Usually this might become under worldhood, I think, is what some people you could frame it in that way, which is trying to get at how we understand existence in context with a certain backdrop. You could frame it that way. You could frame it in other ways, but that's what comes to mind first for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could think about it phenomenologically in the sense of it. When I say the given world or the given, it's something that comes to us, as it were, from not our own choice, right? And so it's given in that sense. And so this, as I say, there's two postures we can take. One I call the choosing controlling stance. And so all human beings adopt this stance whenever they seek to make their lives better, when they seek improvement. It's an attempt we make choices, we control the circumstances of our lives as best we can. We seek to overcome and transform the given in many respects. And so I think this is an important part of human life. Although I think we also have to find a place for what I call the second stance, which is the accepting, appreciating stance. So this imposes limits on the choosing, controlling stance. So one of the questions is, what is a proper relationship between these two stances, and choosing, controlling, and then accepting and appreciating? And you see this particularly in discussions in bioethics. There's those who place sort of primary emphasis on choice and control, and those who place primary emphasis on acceptance and appreciation. So you might think, for instance, at the end of life, should we control the timing and manner of our death? You might think of assisted suicide, or should we just accept death as it comes? I mean, we might try to mitigate the pain, but are we to take life into our own hands? And those who object to doing so often refer to that as playing God. It also comes up in debates about genetic engineering. This is something I get into some in that first chapter. I think this is a very prominent place. Should we choose the kind of children we have, or should we accept them as they come? And there's many areas in life in which we can, make decisions, or we have to think about these two stances of, what should I see as up for choice and up for control, and what should I see as something to be first accepted and appreciated? Now, I think the argument I make is that I think we need to see the choosing, controlling stance as informed by an accepting, appreciating stance. So we only know what choices to make by, first of all, beginning from an appreciative stance towards the world. Sure. First of all, accepting and appreciating what has value in the world, rather than just seeing to use this line from Shakespeare, seeing the world as our oyster to sort of do with what we will. I mean, another area, I don't talk about this as much, it comes up a little bit in the economic limits chapter, but I think these postures you see come up also in discussions around environmental ethics. So there's a number of areas, I mean, throughout life, they're fundamental existential stances, so you might expect them to come up in different areas in human life. So I think these limiting virtues are about getting that relationship right, that we have a sort of proper relationship between those two fundamental existential stances. So humility recognizes, again, that some things need to be accepted and appreciated as given and not subject to our control or manipulation, not to see ourselves as we're masters of the universe. And so that's where you can see why humility particularly is a particularly, it's what I call the master limiting virtue. But the same is true with reverence. Reverence is the sort of second limiting virtue that I go on to discuss as closely connected. When we show reverence, another way we might put it is piety, which has even maybe stronger religious connotations. We recognize something as worthy of reverence, as having dignity, or even we might say sanctity or sacredness. And so therefore setting limits upon our will. So we're recognizing when we have a reverent stance towards something, that it imposes certain limits on our will. So if I have reverence for a human being or for our common humanity, that places limits on what I can do in relation to the person. So when we talk about violations of human dignity, in a way, that's a failure of reverence, failure to revere or to have respect for the dignity of our common humanity. So hopefully that is beginning to sort of fill out the picture a bit. But
yeah, no, you explain it well. I have many follow-ups here. So I guess it's a technical piece here, and it might just be a semantical thing here, but I guess the terms, so these virtues and values, would you see those as distinct or kind of synonymous? Is there overlap? We don't have to spend a lot of time on it if it's too much similarity. I don't want to get bogged down in definitions, but do you see those as synonymous or are they distinct? And if so, is it important?
Yeah, I would say virtues have value.
Okay.
That they have, I would say, intrinsic value. But they also are, in my view, modes of being properly responsive to what's of inherent or intrinsic value in the world. So, for instance, just take, let's go back to the virtue of reverence. So, sure. A virtue here, as I'm using it, is as a kind of character disposition, right? It's a way you form yourself, you form your desires or orientations towards the world, such that you are properly responsive to what's of value in the world, right? And so reverence, again, what I'm calling the virtue of reverence. Of course, reverence can also be a feeling, but as a virtue, it's a character trait, that involves certain dispositions towards proper responsiveness. And what it's responsive to is the value of a case would be the value of another human being, but it could also be God. It could be some sacred spot. It could be the environment as imposing limits upon our will, maybe certain scenes of natural beauty that shouldn't be spoiled. So it places certain kinds of limits upon us. So the proper responsiveness of reverence is to the reverence worthy or to the sacred or the dignified. And it properly responds to that by acknowledging certain limits upon our will, certain ways in which the value should not be, as it were, trespassed against. And I think the virtues in being properly responsive actually constitute for us our fulfillment. So when we're properly responsive to value, it actually is what it is for something to be valuable and have proper responsiveness to it, just is for it to make our lives more fulfilling or more meaningful, right? So when we develop the virtues like reverence, or to go back to the generosity, when we become a generous person or a loving person, we're properly responsive to the value there is in the world, and it's inherently fulfilling. In fact, the virtues themselves, Aristotle says we act virtuously for the sake of the noble, that having the virtue and acting virtuously is itself noble and constitutive of what he calls, the Greek term is eudaimonia. And you probably know this, but there's a lot of debate over how that term should be understood. Some people it's often translated as happiness, but people tend to think of happiness in more subjective terms. Some people, because of that, have talked about it as flourishing. So it's like flourish, like there's you can talk about the flourishing of a plant. You can talk about flourishing of a human being. But I think in many ways that's too, as it were, third personal, or it doesn't get at the meanings as much. So I actually think, eudaimonia, which often gets translated as happiness, is happiness understood as like a deeply meaningful, fulfilling life. Right. Aristotle at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics said, if life were just about amusement and we had to go through all these pains and toil, then life would be absurd. Life has to be about something serious. So it has to be of something of real value. So that sense of happiness is actually, it's a normative notion. It's something higher. It's something noble or dignified in a certain way. And so when we're properly responsive, as the virtues make us properly responsive to what's of value, it actually constitutes for us a more meaningful life. And so again, this is kind of building on my previous book, Virtue and Meaning, that there's this close relationship between cultivating these virtues of character and our achieving a meaningful life. So that's how I'm thinking about the virtues in relationship to value. Now, obviously, these are contested notions, right?
Sure.
So I think this is why, again, I think you have to appeal kind of from within an ethical outlook. Now, someone may not share everything, may not share all aspects of your ethical outlook, but you try to show them what's at stake and whether you accept that ethical outlook or not. But I think things like human dignity or certain notions of human excellence are pretty broadly accepted. But I think, yeah,
sort of, yeah. So I'm trying to, I'm understanding everything you're saying. You're explaining it very well, I think. I guess where I'm having a problem with this, and not necessarily me personally, just in terms of the construct here, is, well, we can continue to talk about Aristotle's notions of the virtues of sorts, kind of thinking about the higher good and all that stuff. But I guess the other thing or the main thing that I'm really trying to really pinpoint down is I'm hearing all the counters here. And the counters that I'm hearing in my head are, there's a lot of assumptions that are being made here about ethics, values, virtues. So let's take reverence for a minute, right? I'm going to try and make this intentionally. I'm trying to make this applied.
Yeah.
So forgive me in advance if you don't want to speak on some controversial matters, but I think this is actually a really good example. So there are basically two, well, I guess maybe there's more, but it kind of falls out into two camps of sorts with the Colin Kaepernick kneeling at the flag, right? I think this is a very good example of reverence, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
You will have half the country that says that's absolutely disrespectful, it's despicable, that's not respectful, that's not showing reverence to the flag and everything that has meaning with that, right?
Yeah.
History, culture, sacrifice, symbol, etc. Right? And there are many people that will make that argument. And then you will have the other half of the country that will make the other argument. He's standing for the higher good. He's for human rights, for the rights of many African Americans in the United States, and all of the really tough history that Black Americans have had. He's using his platform. He's trying to create some other kind of juxtaposition of a symbol of kneeling, of saying, hey, I'm not gonna show reverence in the way that you want me to. And I think he connected it with much of the police violence, etc. Whatever. He had a notion of it, and there was a purpose for it. And there was, some people would say that was, it was a brave thing to do. Obviously, it kind of took some personal cost for him, etc. But for many people, that was an irreverent act. And so when you're saying much of these things about the virtues, and you take a virtue like reverence, or if you use the kind of religious overture of piety, I guess my question is, where is something like that rooted in, and how does it spill out? Because you could literally take an example of something, a flag of a country usually sparks some type of healthy nationalism, some type of symbol of pride, some type of patriotism, and there's a reverence that you have for your country, right, etc. And that's one way of showing that, right? People can show it in different ways, right? If someone were to burn the flag, that would be an irreverent thing, right? So there's levels or dimensions to this. And so how I mean, not that there's a right answer, but there can just be a divergence of where people's ethics fall out here. And so I think it's very hard to make a broad statement of, well, the virtue of reverence. But how do we know what it's rooted to at bottom if so many different people are going to see it in different ways? If it was this higher thing, if it was less relative, how could that be that so many people are going to see it in different ways, assuming the fact that they're being honest and genuine and all those things about it or whatever? But how do you kind of see that?
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I mean, because I think what it shows is that while there are real disagreements there about what reverence requires, it's against a backdrop of agreement that reverence actually is a virtue. Like, it's important to be reverent, that there would be something wrong with being irreverent. I mean, it's not like Colin Kaepernick is just responding by saying reverence isn't a virtue.
Right.
That could be one kind of response, but he's actually, no, this is what actually reverence requires. And I think that's then a point of debate within broader agreement. Now,
but there are
so
people that won't care about that. There will be people that don't care about. It doesn't matter if you talk during the national anthem or whether you put your hand over you. To people, there's a large amount of people that just don't care. It's not a big deal for them. How?
That's true. Yeah. So that's a more interesting. Yeah, that's a more interest. I mean, I find that to be a more interesting case is the person who just doesn't care about reverence at all. I wouldn't. Now, some of it, I mean, the Colin Kaepernick debate, I mean, it's been a while, but I mean, some of it just seems like there's ideological posturing on different sides, and
sure,
ideology can always rot the brain when thinking about ethical questions. But sure. But I think there are people who, well, I mean, I guess one of the questions is can any culture or any human being live without something that they regard as sacred? Right.
Yes,
so we might use the language of the sacred here. I think an interesting area is in comedy. Usually comedy is sort of intentionally irreverent, right? But there's always also those jokes that you're like not supposed to make, like especially around race. I mean, I think that's become like maybe for a long time, but this certain kinds of things that are just demeaning, especially given the historical circumstances. Demeaning of people's dignity or the sacredness of each human life. And so, what can't you joke about is always a very interesting, revealing aspect of, a culture. Now, I do think there are tendencies towards, that nothing is, as it were, off limits, right? I mean, I think there are some comedians, that have very few limits, right?
Sure.
And we might wonder, maybe like comedy has a special function in culture. You think about like medieval societies of like carnival where you upend the social order. In a way, it's a nod to the social order or the sort of the culture by saying, okay, we set aside this space in which, we can joke about these things, but we're not really serious in denying, the kind of things the sacred things of the culture,
Yeah, they can stretch the boundaries. We I think as a culture have given comedy or yes, kind of the old gesture or whatever, that this kind of a little bit more it's a little bit more elastic. Like they're able to kind of stretch boundaries a little bit more than maybe you or I would if we're not comedians. So okay, there's a little bit, if the boundary line ends here for you and I, it's going to be another, 20 meters for the comedian or people in that sphere. There is still a limit there, but they get a little bit more. They can push that more, at least historically.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's other unwritten rules too about, particular comedians based on gender or race or other things can make certain jokes more than other people could, or say certain things or longevity, I think probably works in there, and age probably works in there, and have they earned certain, there's certain, all of these things culturally that we kind of say, but I mean, it's Richard Pryor. I mean, come on. I mean, he's been around forever. It's Robin Williams. I mean, a guy's been around forever, these people are past now, but I'm just saying at the time they get a little bit more than the person that's been doing comedy for 5 years or something. So I think we do give these kinds of things, but I guess the point is that not everyone's going to have the same things for reverence, and
that's true.
That's fine. But there are some people that don't care, have a different idea of reverence, and some that have another idea of reverence. And so I guess
that's right.
All of my point in saying that is, how do we have, when you scale it, when you're talking about with groups, what is it kind of, these virtues, what are they rooted in, right? I think I actually think it's easier if it's rooted in some kind of religious counterpart here, right? Because you say, well, it comes from on high. This is the authority. This is the final stopping point. okay, so, we listen to that, or we all agree on this, right? If to
Yeah.
be Muslim, to be Christian, to be Jewish, to be whichever, religion you subscribe to, well, to do this, to call yourself this, to have this, to be part of this club, this is what we say is reverent, and this is what we say is irreverent. Now, some people may, again, there might be some obviously wiggle room there, but for the most part, that's the containment factor. But when you do not have a system like that, if you take a secular humanist secular kind of society, I don't think we have that. I don't think when people try to do that, and this is what makes the Aristotle piece of it interesting, because I think he was trying to do some of that, but and they had the gods and things like that. But I think in the modern age, I just don't think you can have universals, which I don't know if it makes the virtues themselves fall apart, but I just think you're going to have people at the very least operating with different virtues and or different interpretations of the virtues. I don't know how you can get around that. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so let me say something about the morality from on high. I think this worldview question is a very important one, and it's a central one. I think ethics needs to take this seriously. And it's something I went into, in much more depth in the previous book on, virtue and meaning, thinking about the meaning of life, and what kinds of pictures of the world can make sense of our moral experience. I think those are all really important questions. I will say, I don't think, there's different ways to think about religious ethics. One is this kind of divine command theory view, which says that something is right or wrong just because God commands in favor of it or against it. I actually think even from a religious outlook, I don't think that's a very workable ethical framework, because it makes morality arbitrary. Why be moral? It's just like because you don't want to get in trouble with God. And why not murder people? Well, because God said it's, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. Well, that doesn't really tell us the reason not to, in my view. The reason we don't murder people is because we're violating the value of a human life. Now, where I do think a religious worldview can come in legitimately is sort of in our understanding of the world and of human life. And so, seeing human beings as made in the image of God certainly makes a difference for grounding something like the virtue of reverence as it applies to human beings, right? Now, there's a number of, secular attempts to ground the value of human life. Kant, for instance, on our sort of rational powers of self-determination, our ability to act according to morality, and as he construes it. Even Aristotle, I actually don't see Aristotle as a secular ethicist exactly, because, he's got this sense of we have an element of the divine within us, and we should be striving to realize that element as far as possible. So I think that's a real live question. And partly I want the book to force those kinds of questions. I do think, I end talking about the Sabbath, which is a religious practice. And these virtues are at home in a religious outlook. But I also, I think they can have a real draw for all of us as human beings. I think they're part of our humanity. So one person who was influence on me was Cora Diamond, she's not a theist herself, but she wrote this essay called The Problem of Impiety. And so one thing, we might try to do, and this is partly what she's trying to do in that essay, it was actually in a volume I put together called Spirituality and the Good Life. One thing she's trying to do is what happens when we don't have piety? So this sort of goes back to your initial question there, or like one aspect of that question. That's an interesting question to me. What would be a kind of fundamentally irreverent culture? I think actually comedians, again, are good examples, because there's oftentimes real nihilism and oftentimes a very bleak outlook on life. Not always, but depending on the comedian. But what happens when we don't have that? What happens when we just again see the world as our oyster, or sort of everything's up for grabs, so to speak? So one thing I talk about there is so I think there are these specific questions you're talking about. Okay, let's say we agree on reverence, right? So that's let's say we think it's a virtue, but then we disagree on how to apply it, right? So that's sort of one set of cases, right? And we might get into details on how we do that. The harder one maybe is the person who doesn't acknowledge reverence at all as a virtue, who thinks this is just a bygone superstitious virtue that we're better off without, right? So basically the person who says there's nothing worthy of reverence, they're saying there's nothing beyond my choices, my willing, that can place, is of such great importance that it can place constraints on my desires and my choices, right? That's the posture of someone who says there's nothing worthy of reverence. There's nothing to stop me from doing whatever it is I happen to want, maybe except for prudential self-concern, or I don't have an appetite for going out and murdering a bunch of people, or I don't want to go to jail, or whatever the case may be.
Right.
But I think that there's a deeper lurking thread of nihilism in that position, in the position that says like everything is just about my choices, right? That I can sort of see the world as sort of a tool for my personal enhancement, my fulfilling whatever my desires happen to be. I cite the philosopher David Wiggins, who says, if we see everything as sort of up for grabs in that way, a new disquiet assails our desires. Why desire anything, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Or another philosopher, Michael Sandel, says, this vision of freedom unfettered by the given threatens to leave us with nothing but our will. And if we have nothing but our will to affirm, and if we have nothing but our will to affirm, I suggest then we may not have anything to will at all. So it'd be a sort of profoundly debilitating condition in which there's nothing of great value. So why is choice so important? The whole idea of the importance of choice operates against the backdrop of things that are genuinely significant. Again, to go back to Aristotle, he says that if we're all just about pleasure, then given all the hardship of the human condition, then it would have been better never to have been born, right? So again, life has to be about something serious. And for Aristotle, it was contemplation. It says, we're here to behold the order of the universe and just appreciate it, right? So it's a sort of appreciative stance. So one point is just to make this point that if we don't have reverence, we find ourselves in a bad existential predicament, right? So that's a kind of like, it's an argument to say if we don't have it, we're going to fall into this thing. Now, it may be true that maybe life is just bleak and that's how it is, right? But I'm forcing the question, right? I'm forcing the issue. And that sort of motivates the question, okay, now what would it look like to live with reverence? And so, one of the things with reverence is just we show reverence to the sources of our existence.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our parents, could be the natural world, could be our country. So we can go back to the issue of the flag, and partly that's connected with the value of life and seeing that as, so it's a certain, it's a schema of value, right? By which we can make sense of the world. And I think all we can do at the end of the day is say, does this fit our experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no sort of there's no, what the philosopher Bernard Williams called an Archimedean point outside of our sort of ethical schema or framework of value that we're living in.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question ultimately is, what makes sense of the things I'm living? Now, I do think our worldviews matter. And can they support the sort of things that, are what we might call our moral phenomenology? Do we have a worldview that makes sense of that? If we don't, then maybe we have to give it up, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we think that we're just, what the cosmic cat coughed up, so to speak, through the blind processes of evolution, and there's no rhyme or reason, I do think that could be tremendously corrosive of the ethical life. The philosopher Daniel Dennett referred to Darwinism as universal acid. It has a sort of corroding effect. And so I do want to force these sort of larger worldview questions and to show what's at stake in them. But argument now is always going to be this. Charles Taylor has this idea of, he calls it ad hominem practical reasoning. So ad hominem is not the fallacy where you sort of like say something negative about the person to undermine their argument, but rather what it means is to the person or, to the human being, that we appeal to what we are moved by or not moved by. And maybe me and you are both moved by certain things, but maybe we have some disagreement about, what that entails. You again might think about the Colin Kaepernick example. You say, well, shouldn't we be grateful for our country, right? And then, maybe Colin Kaepernick says, well, yeah, there's things to be grateful about, but I also want to point out this, maybe something that's being missed. Like for some people, their experiences of being American hasn't hasn't been as easy as it is for other people. And I want to call attention to that. And so I think it enables a sort of, maybe there's a way of coming together there. I'm not going to try to say what the I don't want to give a Pollyannish view about we're all going to, if we just talk about it. I think there are deep disagreements because we have different worldviews. And in many ways, this is a line from Iris Murdoch. She says, our moral concepts cause us to see different worlds. In some sense, we can live in different worlds. The hope is that we can find enough overlap in the worlds we live to find some sort of way of living together in relative peace. But I worry about these very things in sort of a hyper polarized culture. But I think if you can at least see that reverence is, if you could have that agreement that there's a virtue of reverence, that's at least a starting point for addressing some of these issues.
Yeah, I'll say this. I mean, I just taking the whole flag thing or other things towards, some nationalism or patriotism or things like that. There are some people that legitimately, I think, don't care about it in a particular environment. I mean, I think if you're put in a very dire situation, and they say, yes, I do love my country. I think there's some pieces of that, if the push comes to shove, but just on a normal Tuesday in the afternoon, they're probably not thinking about it or caring about it as much. But I don't think it means that they don't have reverence for some things. These folks do have reverence for other things, depending on what is most salient for them. But I just want to go back to what you were saying about this whole idea of choice and all these things. I think, at bottom, so it's a long argument, and people fight about it and stuff. So we won't have the debate about free will and all that stuff. And so it's a fun debate, but I find it frustrating most of the times when I've had them. But I think that so my stance, maybe you agree or disagree, is I don't really think we have this kind of free will. I think we mostly, and I don't buy into Dennett's compatibilism kind of argument. Which isn't really that. He changes terms around, and it's very strange how he does it. But I do think that we operate under the illusion in conscious states, the illusion or the guise of free will. Now, some people people disagree with me on that, and that's fine. But I don't really think it matters. I think for a lot of people, they get really hung up on it. And I think when you actually live in a world where that matters less, life looks very different, and you operate very differently. In some ways, I think you can operate somewhat almost more responsibly, because you're not having this idea of I have all of these choices in mind. It's well, one's gonna happen, right? So how do I set myself in certain environments? Obviously there's still responsibility regardless of it, but because you're functioning at basically 2 different or 3 different or 4 different dimensions of conscious states, etc. But I guess the other question here becomes, with what you were saying, is in terms of how we construct and have a functional worldview about things. And so I want to bring in, because this will lead into the moral limits. You write in the first chapter about Nietzsche. My reading of it was, this is my reading, tell me if I'm wrong. My reading of it is that you're not a fan of Nietzsche, but you respect his intellect and maybe his genius in some ways. But my sense of reading it was that you weren't necessarily standing for Nietzsche. That's my take on it. But you talk about how Nietzsche questions the existential limits. And so you talk about his ethic of power. So I guess just describe how you understand Nietzsche and what your thoughts are or not in terms of this existential limits.
Yeah, no, that's great. Real quickly, I'll say some real briefly on free will, but because that's a whole rabbit hole that we could spend a lot of time on. But you appealed to responsibility. I do think some sense of freedom is inherent in our practices of responsibility, of holding people accountable. But to me, I think what matters is our capacity to act from reason, to act for reasons. And so I think that's sort of the groundwork of as it were, of the moral life is our capacity to act from reason.
Sounds very, very Spinoza of you. It's very Spinoza of you.
Or very, very, very Aristotelian of me, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I'll just say that. But that's the important thing. Are there reasons, or are there things that can make demands upon our will that we ought to act in light of? So those is, what I think of as ethical demands. Ethical demands are kinds of reasons. And so our capacity to act from that, I think, is crucial to the ethical life. So I'll set that aside just
Sure.
to give
Sure.
for the listeners, so they understand, my broad position on that. So,
Sure.
but yeah, so Nietzsche, I think Nietzsche is a great thinker. I think one of the things that makes Nietzsche great is he's willing to say things that other people won't say. And I think there are aspects of Nietzsche's work that I think are very, I think there's much that's very profound. I don't agree with all of it, but I think he's attuned to what I think are really crucial questions. So a theme that's been very pervasive in my work is what I call the problem of cosmodicy, which is, you may be familiar with the term theodicy, which is how do we justify God in light of evil and suffering? Right. I think what Nietzsche saw was that actually there's a deeper problem, which is the problem of justifying the world. You can also see this in another of my favorite writers, which is Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov. Oh, yeah. Ivan Karamazov raises this problem of cosmodicy. He wants to hand back his ticket to life in the world. And so, Zosima, the character Zosima, Father Zosima, is Dostoevsky's attempt to respond to this sort of affirmative posture towards the world, seeing it as paradise, taking responsibility. Well, Nietzsche, in his own way, was very motivated by that because he was influenced by Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was his great teacher, although he obviously came to disagree significantly. And of course, Schopenhauer thought that existence was vanity, that the sort of worthless striving, that the best thing to do would be to resign our will to life. Because he thought, he basically had a Buddhist view that our willing or sort of desiring just leads to more suffering. And so best to quiet the will as far as possible. Nietzsche sort of takes the direct opposite view of that, which is, to always be willing, self-overcoming, right? This, probably his most famous quote is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? This sense of that there's a kind of no saying to life because suffering is bound up with life. And so if you're just going to say the goal of life is to eradicate suffering, then essentially that's a kind of nihilistic position. And so Nietzsche was very concerned with this question of cosmodicy, and particularly saying, affirming life or saying yes to life. Now, I think there's many aspects of that's problematic. He thinks those who suffer, those who are weak and vulnerable and not, his ideal of the Übermensch, of the Overman, as the German is often translated, it would be better if they didn't exist, essentially, right? So it's a sort of power ethic that, the ethic of power is essentially that, what we should always be seeking to do is to enhance our power, always overcoming, right? Now, I use Nietzsche because I think he sets up this problem of, especially in the modern world, of our posture towards the world, because, in his famous death of God statement, which is, he believes that because of sort of modern science and that basically we've made God unbelievable. Again, I think that's a contested point, but I'm more interested in what he sees as the implications of that. And his first response is this kind of vertigo experience. So we don't have an orientation anymore. We don't know which way is up, which way is down. But then and he says, well, we're going to have to become gods to appear worthy of this, right? So he sort of comes up with this solution that we can, as it were, play God. And this is, again, his idea of the Übermensch, or the overman, the person who transcends humanity, or seeking to go beyond what he calls the human all too human. Mm-hmm. And so this gives rise to this sort of exhilarating experience of he describes it as like an open sea, that we can sort of chart ourselves out upon. It's like the world is ours to do with what we will. So, I think that sets up, that's one version of this Promethean posture towards the world. So I think he's getting at crucial issues, but I think it's ultimately problematic. And I think one is, some of the things he wants to reject is like things like, concern for, the least of these, or for those who are downtrodden, for, like it's not an egalitarian ethic by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, it's a kind of reaction against certain leveling some of that I appreciate. There are problematic leveling tendencies, but I think, you have to sort of thread the needle right on those issues. My view is essentially informed by, one of the virtues I talk about is neighborliness, which comes out of the Judeo-Christian teachings on love of neighbor. And of course, Nietzsche, had no time for this talk of love of neighbor. But the thing I try to bring out there is that he's fundamentally concerned with affirming the world, right? But it's not because the world makes demands upon us, or it has this inherent value to which we ought to be responsive. Rather, he sees it as sort of the ultimate triumph of willpower. In the face of everything, can you affirm the world? Even though it gives you, maybe no reason whatsoever to affirm it, it's a sort of ultimate expression of the will to power. And again, the problem with that is like, why do it? Why think that's so important? It goes back to that sort of what I call the threat of nihilism. If there's nothing worth affirming, right, it undermines our willing. The will itself depends upon, for the will to have its have its vitality and its function in our lives. It has to be responsive. It has to first be responsive to something of value beyond us. I quote this brief line from this Hungarian philosopher, Kolonai, who says, response, not fiat, is the prime gesture of the human person. That we first have to begin by sort of a kind of contemplative mode of appreciation of the world and the given good, as it were, if we're going to be able to will, but including affirm the world. So if we're going to address this problem of cosmodicy, then we have to see the accepting, appreciating stance as more fundamental than any choosing, controlling stance. Again, it should lead to, when you think there are things of value, it'll lead you to make choices and to bring about good in the world when there's things that you think are valuable. But there's sort of two other points I make about, so not only do we first need to appreciate what's of value to know how to act at all, or to be motivated to act in the world, but also there's two other things, is that we're not actually ever going to achieve perfection. We're never going to realize some perfect state of affairs. Now, Nietzsche wasn't himself necessarily, he thought it was always overcoming. But the point here is that we need some way of being at home in the world amidst imperfection. We need a way of saying, in spite of the evil and suffering that exists, life is good, life is worth affirming. And so we need to find our way to some posture like that towards the world. If we're going to adequately address what I call the problem of cosmodicy, we need some way of coming to be at home in the world amidst the ill, right? We need to find enough good. We need to have an orientation that enables us to see the good in the world. And so that's another reason why I think an appreciative stance is more fundamental, because just to affirm life in the world at all, we need to find, if we're going to be able to act well and not be in despair, we need to find something, to say that it's good to be here. It's good to have been born in spite of the misery of it all. Not just misery, but you need to find enough good that makes it seem worthwhile. And then a third point I bring up is that, in an important sense, our achievements themselves are not complete without our appreciation of them. So this is why I end on a reflection on the Sabbath at the end of the book, is that, again, I think I want people to think about the Sabbath as something, whether, you believe in God or not, that practicing something like the Sabbath has real sort of existential importance. That if you look at the creation story in Genesis, the 7 days of creation, it's interesting to call it the 7 days of creation. What does God do on the seventh day? Rests, right? He rests and appreciates the creation. He's, at the end of the sixth day, he declares it very good, and then rests and presumably appreciates the work that's been done. So the sense there is that, not only does appreciation come first, you might say, in sort of the order of our acting in the world, that we first have to appreciate to know how to act. It also comes last in the sense of it's the completion of the activity. It completes the activity. So again, this is part of why Aristotle argues that the highest form of life is the contemplative life. On a broadness point, to say all of our activities are completed by our appreciation of them. So when you do something, that you think you've done well, you actually complete that activity in that mode of appreciating it. And so I think a practice of the Sabbath, of stepping back from our work or activity, is actually of crucial importance, for living well as human beings. And so those are sort of 3 points about why this accepting, appreciating stance needs to be regarded as more fundamental than any choosing, controlling sense. And all of those points, I think Nietzsche is problematic.
Yeah, no, you outline it pretty well, and you give a nice argument, I think, for some of the differences here. So I think I fundamentally disagree here.
In your case,
yeah, let me spell out how I see this a little bit. So on the first point, I don't think it's necessary to have a higher aim that's virtuous or good or anything like that to do something. I don't. So here's part of the reason why I think a philosophy like Nietzsche's is a little bit more superior than others. A lot of other philosophies have so much. They have so much smuggled into it, and it's hard to divorce it from that. And I think Nietzsche's is the one that gets closest to not doing that. I think he does maybe in some ways, but he starts with, so the way I see it is that Nietzsche's philosophy is one of life. And it's a philosophy of life that's active as opposed to a passive one, right? Mm-hmm. How do you accept, so him starting with Schopenhauer, starting with Wagner, starting with, the Greeks, makes a lot of sense, right? Mm-hmm. Look, what is life? What does it mean to be in the world? What does it mean to be human? Well, here are some things we can know without any other. You could have no concept of any virtue, any kind of value system. And in fact, those things are problematic to understanding life, in his case. I don't know if it's entirely that way, but I see the logic there. You could have no concept of a deity. You can have no concept of any kind of religious structure. And these things are going to be true, whether you like it or not, right? We exist. That's a fact, right? I mean, that's a fact. How we exist or where we come from, we may not know that, but the fact that we are conscious and we're living and we're breathing, that's a fact, right? And we can talk about some of the things about Descartes, how he assumed the I, and then what Kant did after him, and et cetera. Okay, those are important questions. I mean, Hegel's system was super important. Okay, fine. But with Nietzsche, it was we live, we're on the planet, and we suffer. Part of the reality of life is suffering. And in fact, it's a necessary component of living, because I think it tells you what's real in life, more so than other things. But the fact is that kind of like that open water concept you were talking about is we don't know all of the things about ourselves. We don't know all of the things that we could uncover, or the things we could find out. And the thing about life is the way to try and overcome all of these things is to continue to find how we live an active life. Now, the thing with that is that many people will say, well, what if I don't want to do it? Okay, that's fine. And some people opt out. Okay. But the point is that I think if you're trying to say, hey, how am I trying to figure out what is going on? Well, you can't ever say, I'm here for a purpose or a meaning, or what comes afterwards. You can tell yourself whatever you need to tell yourself, but that doesn't mean it's empirically true. What is true is what we have, and that's our will, that's our instinct, and that's the fact that we exist on life. And outside of that, we can find much value from within that. So I always see like the will to power is like this, almost this type kind of this energy that's pushing. It's this energy that's pushing all living organisms. And I don't think it is required that it's pushing towards a goal. Unless you're talking about vitality, the sustenance of life, that it continues, that it keeps moving on. But I think there's enough openness to it that you can put in whatever meaning or value you want in that. And that's the beautiful thing about it. Now, the important point that you make about how do we do that with other people, and how do we do that with the other, and how do we do that with the other in the world? Those are, I think, open-ended, great questions. But I don't think that they're totally spelled out for us either, with some set of virtues or values that a couple of humans, that we've evolved from 300,000 years ago decided to make up. I just don't see. I think the things that connect us with all other multicellular living organisms at bottom is the same. There's this instinctual will. There's this instinctual striving for trying to live. And then how you live is really up to you. And that really is the importance of the individuality of the person. Now, I will agree with you that I think, Nietzsche has some, not as expansive ideas about how to live in the world with the other. I think he was less interested about that. I think somewhat to his detriment. But I think that at the end of the day, this is a charitable reading of this, you can only focus on you and what you can do. I can't focus on how you live your life as much as I really, 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 really may want to. And in some ways that would be a way of, I'll throw a word in here that's loaded, but that wouldn't be respectful of what your choice is for that, right? I mean, there's a lot of words in there that I'm not defining, but you get what I'm trying to say. And I think I think you can have all of that without these virtues or values that are needing to kind of receive off of it, which is maybe antithetical for some people. But I think that explain how life occurs. Explain how the first organisms occurred, unicellular organisms, multicellular organisms, how the earth has been formed, how the universe. We can't explain that, again, unless you're, just taking the easy way out and just saying, well, there's a creator of the universe and made it all and blah, 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 blah. I mean, we probably know that to not be true based on empirical evidence and data, but maybe not. There's always the 1% chance that maybe that's true. But how would humans be any different? Why? Because we have evolved brains to think about things, to have certain ways of denial and self-deception, and to have certain systems and to use tools and to, figure out problems and have intelligence, but because we're social. Well, I don't think that because we're social necessarily inherently or innately says all of these things. Of course, we have things like reciprocity, interdependence, intersubjectivity, etc. All of these things. And those are just ways in which we can do things. I think it's hard to really say invested within human nature is some at bottom virtue or value. I think we can say those things, but I don't think that they're inherent of what it means necessarily to be human. I don't think that means that we shouldn't do those things. It doesn't mean that we can't love your neighbor as yourself, that we can't have all of these ways in which we build these hierarchies. That's fine. But I think in terms of first principles, I think Nietzsche's thing is you have to focus on your life. How do you live it actively? How do you accept the suffering? And how are you using the will to power to overcome those things to live the best way that you want? To me, that is a pretty terrifying aspect for a lot of people, but I think in many ways it can be a much more, if you will, freeing and open way of doing things. So that's my counter. I don't know if you agree or disagree
you're
there.
Pretty core, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certain things I agree with, certain things I disagree with. I think we're getting to the nub of some disagreements. I will say I don't think it's as improbable that there's a God as you suggest. But that, again, that's like free will. That's another bigger discussion.
Sure.
But that would get into questions about whether there's whether we can find purpose in the universe and those sorts of questions, right? Mm-hmm. But I think part of what you're raising here is sort of questions of what we might call philosophical anthropology. What are human beings? So you're sort of pushing this, sort of similarity between human beings and animals. Of course, you mentioned we have intelligence. So one of the characters in a novel by Flannery O'Connor called "The Violent Bear Away" says we're like pigs that can calculate, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the questions is like, what difference does rationality make? Does it mark like a massive transformation? Is it just that we can more effectively sort of plan and try to attain whatever desires it is that we happen to have? Or does it sort of give us access to a realm of moral demands to which we need to be responsive, right? And so that's obviously one of the big questions here in the background. Now it sounds like you don't want to go full on moral nihilism here. I mean, you mentioned respecting people's choices. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, that's like the autonomy, what I call the autonomy-centered ethic, very much prominent within a broadly liberal point of view that what's most important about people is their capacity to choose whatever the ends they happen to choose. It's like an ideal of authenticity. You do you, I'll do me, and that sort of thing.
Of sorts. I mean, you can. Yeah. I think it's. I guess my. Let me refine this. It's not that it's only that. I think it's more of what I may choose as my values or my standards could very well be commiserate with what you do and with what many people in my community do and what many people in my nation state do or whatever. Yeah. That it doesn't mean that it's always contrarian. I mean, there's going to be tremendous amounts of overlap because of where I am in history, of where I am in culture, with where I'm in my environment. Of course, those things impact. And I think a lot of the times they overlap, but I think that they need to be yours and not only borrowed from other people or other structures. You have to create, or not create it, but you have to define that. And many people just borrow whatever from religion, from politics, from whatever. So that's kind of how I just refined that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I certainly would expect, given that we are the evolved creatures that we have with a common sort of evolutionary ancestry, that we'd have certain kinds of proclivities in common. As you mentioned, reciprocity and certain kinds of modes of compassion, but also aggression. There's some pretty problematic tendencies as well. So part of the problem, I mean, you could say, well, we have this, if you just take your sort of the desire set that you happen to have, right? Well, I think in many ways, it's a mixed bag. There's going to be things in there that you pick out as good and things that you pick out as bad. Like, we don't just live like non-human animals. I mean, if you watch Discovery Channel or something, just observe animal behavior. There's a lot in animal behavior that we do not want to replicate. Mm-hmm. And so part of the sort of civilizing process, the process of ethical formation, is to sort of bring out our distinctive humanity, to live in light of certain noble ideals, right? Now, Nietzsche had his own sense of nobility. So but for him, it was sort of power was overcoming, right? Well, that's a contestable view. And I think ultimately it's self-undermining if there's nothing of value that we're being responsive to. So if it's all just, we just respect people's choices, it's not clear why we should even respect people's choices. I don't think Nietzsche himself would have said that. I think, the reason that, choice matters, or we might appeal to things like conscience, we talk about freedom of conscience and law, is because we think there's people see themselves as responding to something making demands upon them. So I think if you just kind of live in the moral phenomenology, it's a further kind of debate of what could ground that. But I think a lot of the Nietzschean paradigm is not actually very livable. And I think if it's just desires, again, this goes into like, what kinds of beings are we? I think we are fundamentally, this is the way I put it in the Virtue and Meaning book, we're meaning-seeking animals who can step back from our desires and ask, what should we desire? Is this thing worth pursuing? We can raise those sort of questions. And if it's not worth pursuing, then, it can be sort of undermined for us. It's value for us. And I don't think meaning or value is something like that can be created whole cloth. Now, we can act in light of what we think is intrinsically valuable and seek to create lives of meaning in light of that. But this idea that we can just sort of say, like, sticking a stick in the mud is, a meaningful activity. I don't think that's a plausible view. And so I think that's where I think if it's just willpower and if it's just this sort of individualist, you do you, the sort of idea of authenticity, which has been one of the ways that people have been attracted to Nietzsche's work. I think authenticity itself has to be, it's derivative. The value of it's derivative upon there being things to which we can live authentically, truly in response to. And so that's why I do think that there's a kind of, I mean, again, you could sort of set aside the worldview questions, like what could make sense of this. The question is more existential, like what is a philosophy we could actually live by? In this sense, I think Schopenhauer actually, like I don't agree with Schopenhauer on a lot of things as well, but the sense of like being bored, like your desires, like there's a kind of like vanity there. If it's just about like, the titillation of the moment. Okay, you had that, and then what's next, right? What's after that, and I think that is a real problem if there's nothing. I mean, there's a way of interpreting Schopenhauer that what he's really getting at is that we need some kind of contemplative ideal, that we need something that we can just, for him, aesthetics or beauty played a crucial role. Now, I think that needs to be understood as also informing our acting in the world. I mean, I think that's the problem with Schopenhauer, is the sense that we just resign the will, as if it were the choices were this sort of restless willing that can never be fulfilling versus, this sort of like ceasing to will and then appreciating. I actually think appreciating is a kind of willing. It's an affirmation. It's an act of the will to affirm something and to appreciate it. And that should in turn feed our acting in the world. So my point, one way to put my point is that the Nietzschean project can't even get off the ground with it. I mean, it's parasitic upon there being things worth willing in the world, right? And then again, there's other things like, I think, his ethic of will to power, if it's all just about the individual, then you get this sort of like Darwinian kind of survival of the fittest, or, again, maybe you have like reasons to get, maybe you just happen to be constituted that you really like to, love other people, and, but why should you? I mean, there's a way in which our rationality can make us step back from those things and say, well, I could live another way. So the philosopher John McDowell raises this thought experiment of what he calls the rational wolf. Imagine a wolf who becomes rational and could raise the question: should I hunt with the pack, or should I be a free rider? Right? Like, and I think it's a helpful way to think about like the difference that rationality makes. That we can step back from those natural inclinations or instincts that we have. And it's part of being human. Now, some people think this is the curse of our humanity, that it's the sort of coming into rational self-consciousness, that we become alienated from our environment, from our humanity, because like we're not just living in the flow of our instincts, right? But in one sense, it may be a curse because it raises these difficult existential questions. But I think it's also a blessing if you can find a way. I mean, it allows for a meaningful mode of existence that's not possible without it. And so, again, I guess the point is that Nietzsche, I think he's raising certain fundamentally important questions. I just think if it's all willpower, and if it's willpower acting on instinct alone, I think it's sort of self-refuting or self-undermining. And so we may not ultimately agree, come to agreement, but I think the position that it's just willpower, I think it doesn't work at the end of the day. And so that's part of my argument there, is to say that it just doesn't work. Even on its own terms, I don't think it works. But yeah, I guess I don't know if we want to keep going with that, or we could.
No. I'll just say one last thing on that, just as a clarifying point, and then we can move on to the next couple of limits. I'll just say, I don't think it's all will to power, although he obviously talks about it a tremendous amount. I think a lot of it is will to power is the active ingredient in what values you choose or what values you find. And if you repress the instinctual will to power, you will not find that. And you will, what Heidegger says, you live out in the anonymity of the other, or whatever. You let everyone else choose for you. Mm-hmm. That's a destructive way of living. And in fact, you can make the argument that, well, you have all these aims and all these goals. So yeah, so you the Schopenhauer point is fair. This boredom, this kind of just living moment to moment, et cetera, the pleasures. Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with that. I agree with that. but you could, there's plenty of people that do the other. They set all these aims, they set all these goals, and then they're still not fulfilled, right? And so it's you know,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. Again, just to what I'm saying, what I don't think Nietzsche's saying is, it's not that there aren't values, it's not that there aren't an ethics. It's the fact that you do the active life to find that and then operate with that in the world. It's not entirely relativistic. It's just trying to have the ownership of doing the work, and not doing it where we have these universal virtues that don't really exist in some ways, I guess, for him, where it's how do we have a reevaluation of all values? How do we reevaluate and say, hey, wait a minute. Do I think murder is not killing people is a good value, good ethic to have? I think in most scenarios, in most cases, that's probably going to fall out that way. But you can't you can, but I think a universal approach would say, well, we go to war, don't we? We do euthanize people. We do. I mean, there are things that, the assisted suicide thing, there's exceptions to it. And to think through what that value system is instead of taking it based on some, preset, virtues or things like that, I think is the big point. And his thing is, what's pushing all of that is the will to power. But I just see it as a very central active ingredient. I don't think it's that and that alone. That's the only thing my reading of it. I could be wrong. Nietzsche scholars can correct me on that, but
I don't think he sees us as finding value in the world that constrains our will. I think he uses so the question of value is value something that could be created, or is it something that's discovered? Nietzsche is definitely on the side of value creation. Yeah. Now, he thinks some lives are more existentially viable than others because they deal with that problem. What he sees the problem of cosmodesy better. So in that sense, some lives, like the human, all too human lives, don't live for anything truly great, and so they don't justify their existence. But I do think that's a fundamental, I think you maybe are building more into your version of Nietzsche than I think one should. But I think it puts you closer to my view. But I will say, it sounds like one of the worries is you're saying universal values, that somehow would make us inauthentic, that we're just sort of living according to these preset values, and there's something inauthentic about that. I agree with the sort of worry about just doing things because, I think part of maturing as an ethical agent is that you come to affirm, what you think is actually good, that if you make it your own, so to speak, right? But I don't think there's anything about the virtues that says, it puts constraints on the kind of lives we can live, but I think you yourself at least want, the sort of standard liberal view at least says we're constrained by other people's choices, right? Mm-hmm. We at least have to respect their autonomous choice. So no one here, except for maybe Nietzsche himself, and his restraint is that it has to be existentially viable. That has to be something that can allow us to deal with the problem of suffering in life in a sort of life-affirming way. That's his constraint. I would also say, I would agree that we need to find ways that can help us to affirm life in the world. So I'm totally on board with Nietzsche on that point, which I actually think is one of the more Christian aspects of Nietzsche's work, at least this desire to affirm the world. I think that's a very Christian or Judeo-Christian kind of view. But so so I agree with him on that path, right? But then this sort of broader question of are there things that we need to be properly responsive to? I think authenticity, you might think about it. One thing we're talking about is being responsible, being a responsible agent, right? You have your own agency, right? Mm-hmm. And a way to think about that is that responsibility is responsiveness, being properly responsive to what's of value in the world, right? So we're all acknowledging there are some constraints on the kinds of lives we can live, but just because you acknowledge that there are universally valid virtues, that humility is always a virtue, that reverence is always a virtue, that moderation is a virtue, and generosity and justice, it doesn't mean that we don't have to live out our own individual life, that we're just living how people tell us. Mm-hmm. No, I think that would actually not be to be responsible or to be properly responsive to what's of value. And each of us are going to live that out in our distinctive way, given the circumstances of our lives. And so I don't think the kind of authenticity that's worth having is incompatible with recognizing that there are general universally valid virtues. I think there's different ways you live that out within the context of your life. Now, that's how you specify exactly. I got into this a little bit in the previous book, the Virtue and Meaning book. But I think each person has particularities of their own life. And some of it's, the limiting virtues I talk about. For instance, loyalty and neighborliness, we're necessarily placed beings. We're locally situated. And we find ourselves with particular people in our lives that in appreciating those people around us, we form bonds of loyalty and attachment, and their identity constituting bonds of loyalty, and which again proceed from that neighborliness where we're responsive to those people who are around us. That doesn't mean, again, that we shouldn't have concern for general humanity. I think neighborliness is rooted in a respect for humanity, but it recognizes the significance of proximity. So it's a kind of human solidarity, like the Good Samaritan story, where your neighbor is anyone, but it's the person you happen upon. And so I think those are aspects of what I call humane localism, drawing on another political philosopher, Mark T. Mitchell, which is that, we're necessarily local place beings. Our lives will be always local, but it should also be humane in recognizing sort of the humanity of all those that we come across. And so I think authenticity, in the sense of like, it's part of the value of an individual life. I think each individual life has, we have a common humanity, but part of what's wonderful about our humanity is that we can live it out in many different ways. But I think everyone's going to acknowledge some constraints on like how we can live it out. And just because we acknowledge constraints, I don't think means that we can't have some place for some ideal of authenticity. I just think, to some way, ideals of authenticity to me, sometimes they come across as a bit navel gazing, like a little bit too like focused on I'm my own unique individual, when I think that's just going to happen as a matter of course when you seek in your life to be as best you can responsive to what's genuinely valuable. I think when you do that, then you're going to live an authentically meaningful life. And so it's sort of the focus is not so much on, like distinguishing myself necessarily from others, but rather, do I live a life that's in accord with what seems to be truly important? So I think there's just a different sense of authenticity. Some of them I think are problematic and of the navel gazing sort.
Sure.
Others are better.
I think with authenticity, there's definitely the navel gazing piece of it, 100%. I think people that are, kind of really, really investigating that in good faith and really trying to get at that, don't do it that way. There's that kind of McDonald's version of authenticity, which I also don't really like either. I think it's not accurate to what authenticity, at least in a philosophical sense, is. But I would push back. It feeds
into capitalism with like consumer culture and like
it does feed into that too. Yeah, there's that overlay of it. But
so one of the interesting questions is why is authenticity such a predominant modern value? Taylor has this book called The Ethics of Authenticity. So some of what I'm saying is just like there's like debased forms of it and there's like good forms of it. And so I want to distinguish between. Sure. There's forms of it that I do want to endorse. I think to be authentic is simply to. I actually think a way to think about it is having integrity. A kind of we might think of it as like being true to yourself, right? Now, how do we think about that? Is it a matter of like looking deep within to find, some deep desire that's like, that's your true self that's being expressed? Or I actually think deep desires aren't. So I have a paper called Deep Desires. I think deep desires themselves are revealing of what we value, right? What do we think is really important? So I think, again, authenticity has a role. That's why I say it should have an outward gaze. So we may look within, but looking within ultimately points, I think, without to what we regard as truly important. And authenticity shouldn't be the opposed to that.
Yeah, I think with authenticity, it's the way, I mean, integrity is just too loaded for me. I mean, maybe we're saying the same thing, different terms, but integrity's
It's
got
all
too much.
loaded, but yeah.
Yeah, it's got too much. It's got a lot of, there's there's way too much interpretive. I mean, there's interpretive distinctions with everything, I guess, but there's a lot of kind of attributions that are placed with integrity. I would just see it as this type of, how do we understand being itself? How do we try to recognize what it means to be? Like the aspect, it's kind of the ontological argument, which is how are we understanding our own being and our own existence, and then how do we, it's the Sartre thing, right? It's just existence before essence, right? And then we kind of figure that out, and there's a certain type of freedom there, and et cetera. That's kind of how I would see it. So maybe you're saying the same thing, just maybe with some different top spin on it, but maybe not.
Well, no, I'm definitely anti-Sartre. I mean, I think his existentialism as a humanism, it's a terrible mess in my view. I mean, to me, it has the same problem. I mean, this kind of view has the same problems as I identified with the divine command ethic, that we can just, as it were, declare something good, and it's like, it's good. I mean, to me, that's like, that's just arbitrary. So again, you could declare anything good, but that like evacuates good of any sort of meaning. And so like part of what it is for something to be good is that it actually contributes to our human flourishing or our fulfillment, right? And so we do have natures. We have a human nature, and there's ways of what it is to be human, and things that are going to be fulfilling of that humanity or not. So I think one way of thinking about integrity, or just to use another word, I mean, maybe this won't set off the same alarm bells for you. I personally like, I like the term integrity, but another term would be wholeness.
I like the term,
right?
but I'm trying to not put too much. I mean, I'm fine with integrity. Yeah. I'm trying to divorce it from any other moral systems or religious systems or anything. I'm trying to not, because I can hear the word integrity, and that's going to mean something for me, and it could mean something wildly different for someone else. I mean, wildly different. And it's like we're talking about 10 different things, but we're using the same word. There's just a lot that gets, downloaded with that. So that's why I'm just trying. I don't mind integrity, but I that's why I don't like it.
Yeah, these are all what get called in moral philosophy thick ethical concepts. So they come with a lot. But I think there's no way around that. We just have to distinguish. Sure. So what I'm saying is another way we might think about it is wholeness. So we want a kind of wholeness of our humanity. We don't want to be mutilated in our humanity. We want to bring out what's integral to being human, to what is it to live a fulfilling human life. And so I think again, we do that in distinctive ways, but still within the bounds of the kinds of creatures that we are, the human beings that we are. And so I think that's another way to think about integrity, is in terms of wholeness. So again, you might think of authenticity in that way. You're being true to your humanity. There's that, way of thinking. I want to be someone to whom nothing human is alien, right? I want to live out the human condition in the most fulfilling way possible. And so that's why, again, this goes back to what we're calling philosophical anthropology. Like, what is it to be human? I think that's a profoundly important question. So, we may agree on, some aspects of that, and maybe others we disagree. But that's the sort of kind of debate I think we're having, is like, what does it mean to live an authentically human life? Is a way I would want to put it, rather than maybe the focus on the individual. I mean, we are individuals, but we're individual human beings, and so we have to. It's always with respect to, I think, living out our humanity. So, yeah, I'm sure we. There's probably more to be said here.
There's much more to be said here. I'll resist the temptation to keep going on this point, because I do have all these other counters, but I do want to ask, because I want to be mindful of your time. So just kind of briefly give us the I guess kind of the summary of kind of, we touched on a lot of the moral limits, not maybe directly, but we did talk around a lot of that. So maybe just tell us the kind of the other two limits you discuss in the book, the political limits and the economic limits. I know you touched on the localism piece on the political limits, but what are some of the other ways in which we understand our limits politically, at least in your mind, and then maybe that ties in with some of the economic pieces too.
Yeah, great. So, let me just real briefly, I mean, the moral limits, in some sense, all the limits are moral, but I wanted to look at this category that was of interest to moral philosophers. So some of that is, the first part is just on character formation. And so I look at moderation and reverence, moderation emphasized in the Aristotelian tradition, reverence emphasized in the Confucian tradition, but I think both are widely recognized virtues. But anyways, looking at an account of character formation. And then I talked about moral absolutes, which we were somewhat touching on. Are there things that are just always absolutely prohibited? We might actually have some different views on this particular topic. I wouldn't be in favor of euthanasia and those sorts of things. And I think we can make discriminations around just war. So I'm not a pacifist, but I think we should never intentionally take an innocent human life. But that's different than matters of self-defense. Again, that's kind of the realm of like getting into, we may agree in like a reverence for human life, but we may then have an argument about what that entails. So I'll set that aside for now, but I see that again connected with the virtue of reverence. The last part of that chapter is looking actually on what we might call limits to morality, or at least towards how modern morality understands itself as having impartial concern. So I already mentioned briefly neighborliness and loyalty as limiting virtues. So they put limits on the extent to which we can be asked to act on behalf of others, particularly in an impartial way. So I discussed Peter Singer there. I argue that neighborliness and loyalty we should have concern for all human beings, but neighborliness and loyalty are limiting virtues that place constraints on that. So that actually leads into the third chapter. So I look at the debate around patriotism and cosmopolitanism. So this again comes back to some of the things we were talking about with the flag and so forth. Should we be patriotic? And so in the political limits chapter, I begin with that. And I think that's one of the sort of key issues of our time, as the thinker David Goodhart put it in his book, The Road to Somewhere. You have the somewhere people and the anywhere people. It's a way of thinking about patriotism and cosmopolitanism. And it does tend to be that those who are very well-to-do, the highly mobile social status and economic elites of society tend to be in favor of cosmopolitanism. They're increasingly not identifying with their country, although I think there still are many that have patriotic sentiments. But basically, I think I argue that we need patriotism for a number of reasons. One is that we just we're locally placed beings, that we have a need to belong in the place we're from. I think it's actually important if you believe in democracy, I think you have to have some sense of patriotic belonging. Again, I want a humane localism that, again, I think there's difficult questions we could come back to this on immigration. How do you work out a just, humane immigration policy? But I think it's important for democracy that you have this sense of common belonging, sharing in a common democratic project. And then I also think for distributive justice, I think Aristotle's idea of like the political community is it's a community of sharing in a common place, seeking to live together for the common good that makes possible the good life for human beings. And so I think our notion of distributive justice has to be tied to that. And a philosopher, Michael Walzer, said the first question of distributive justice is a question of membership. We can come back to that, but I'll try to just briefly summarize these other parts. So then I go on to discuss distributive justice. I argue for a sufficientarian account over a very prominent form of egalitarian distributive justice called luck egalitarianism. So I am a moral egalitarian. I believe in fundamental human equality, but I'm not. I don't think the goal of distributive justice is to correct all instances of bad luck or any sort of economic difference that's due to luck. I don't think the goal should be to even that out. For instance, it doesn't seem to be important that two rich people are not equally rich. I think what matters is poverty and making sure that people aren't impoverished. And so this is a sufficientarian account. What matters is not that people have the same, but that people have enough. Part of what I get into with the luck egalitarian view is that it actually expresses a problematic posture towards the world, that as if we're to like correct all the David Wiggins calls it a metaphysical crusade against contingency. Another philosopher, Elizabeth Anderson, talks about as if we're correcting a cosmic injustice. I think the task is much more basic than that. I think that leads us in all kinds of problematic and utopian directions that just aren't feasible. I think the goal really is to sustain the common good of the political community and make sure that people have enough to live well, so that we can live in what Tocqueville called an equality of condition. It's not that everyone has the same material circumstances, but that people can live together in terms of mutual respect, that they can work, have their work respected, and make a decent living, and have access to cultural opportunities. And I mean, there's an egalitarian aspect, but I disagree with luck egalitarianism, because it really knows no bounds, and it really tends more in this sort of utopian direction. So I really end up endorsing what I call a politics of imperfection, as a way of best living out our political life. Argue for moderation as an important limiting virtue in politics. So that's the short of it with regard to the political limits. So I'll just state this quickly, and then we can talk about anything in particular. Economic limits is really focused on our sort of condition within a capitalist society. That I think there's certain features of capitalism that promote the idea that we can never have enough, and that we should seek to have as much as we can. That's counter to what I call the limiting virtue of contentment, which is the virtue of knowing when enough is enough, of being properly satisfied. I think that's a hard virtue to live out in our economic lives. But I developed this vision of what I call home economics. This is really going back to the original meaning of the term of economy, derives from the term oikonomia, which has to do with the home. And so in this sense, I pick up on aspects of Marx's worries about capitalism as that it causes alienation. But I don't think Marx's communist utopian solution is the right one. I think actually what we need is to distribute property. I mean, what we need is, it goes back to the sufficientarian account of justice, that people have enough, that people are able to have, businesses if they want of their own, to develop to work and with dignity, have this notion of dignified work that enables them to live well in a place, to be at home in the world, rather than this sort of push for always something more, greater economic and social status. I think ultimately that leads to a problematic form of alienation. So then I end with reflection on the Sabbath, which I try to apply for everyone, whether they are Jewish or Christian or not. That Sabbath is a break from work. We need this space to step back, to reflect upon our work, to appreciate it, to just appreciate the people around us and what's good in the world. And that can actually orient us outside of the Sabbath. It has a sort of crucial orienting function, but it's also a way to sort of come to terms with, a sort of contemplative mode of, I would say it's a way to come to terms with that cosmodicy issue through a contemplative mode of being. That we need occasions, whether you do it on Saturday or Sunday or not. We need occasions of sort of stepping back. We might call it true leisure, where we step back and are able to really appreciate and engage in activities that are valuable for their own sake. So that's the sort of short executive summary of those remaining parts. I'd be happy to sort of get into any of those in more detail.
Well, the only thing that I'm just kind of curious about is and again, it might be an issue of terms, but is this kind of what you were saying? I mean, so I certainly agree with you on this sense of, you said patriotism. I like the idea of kind of a healthy nationalism, which nationalism usually has a really, really, again, negative connotation, which fair enough.
Yeah.
But I think the way I look at it is that you can have a healthy or unhealthy nationalism. And I think a healthy one is right. I think that's, I think it's more than just love of country, which is kind of what I define as patriotism. Love of country and, maybe, I don't know, the flag and the national anthem and, the 4th of July and holidays and whatever, right? It's this kind of this passive kind of thing. I take a healthy nationalism as something where there's a real investment in the country or your local area, whether that's a state or community or a town or things like that, that is really fostering this continuity of like history and culture, and when towns and cities build norms and rituals and customs and things like that, it's having this kind of respect of everyone in the past that's lived there, continues on and is still there, and that is what makes that place, kind of a living organism, sort of, in some ways, not obviously in a natural sense, but you know what I mean? Like this way of it's living, it's moving. And that all is from people that come before you, right? And that has to be respected. Now, you're going to have individual disagreements, you're going to not like certain things, but that you come to it with a certain type of acceptance, and then you have some type of, I don't want to say assimilation, because again, that has a kind of a connotation to it, but this way of how do you understand how things are, norms and culture. So I just see a healthy nationalism as something that, because at the end of the day, right, if you take what is true for most people in the Western world, and I think, it's different around the world, but in the West, I guess, most people want kind of the same things. They all have families. They want to take care of their families. They want to be healthy. They want to have good education, good access, be able to live well. And so that's the common threads. And so then it's this respect of, well, what's been created by a bunch of individuals over time in this one specific space. And then, so I just see it as a very kind of active nourishment of that. And so I think, patriotism is just like, yeah, cool. My country's cool and whatever. I'll, put my hand over, my heart when I do the flag. Like, that's fine. Like but I feel like a healthy nationalism is really important. And I think about it this way because of how animated people become and how polarized people become politically and otherwise because of various things in society and with culture wars and things like that. But I feel like we shouldn't abandon the connective tissue, which is a healthy nationalism for people. I'm going to care more about people in Iowa or Nebraska or Idaho than I am about people in Canada. And it's because it's not because I don't care about humans. I obviously do, but those are my countrymen and women, right? Those are my country folks. Yeah. Like there's a connection there, right? It doesn't, again, mean that I don't care about people around the world. I do, but there is something that, you could say the same way of, if I know someone from, my state or my town or whatever, there's a proximal way of understanding that. I'm going to care more about, my family than I am about the homeless person down the street, right? It's not that I don't care about the homeless person. It's that kind of thing, just scaled really large. I don't know. What do you kind of think about that, or how do you kind of see that?
Yeah, that's interesting because it's interesting you incline more to the word nationalism than patriotism, because I think a lot of people it's the opposite. Like nationalism has like more negative connotations.
Certainly,
patriotism does.
Certainly.
But I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I think to me, again, there's something I can appreciate in the cosmopolitan posture that you want to show concern for all human beings, and that's what's really important. But I think it actually misses something crucial, about our humanity. And there's always that danger of loving humanity. You love no one in particular. I think this is one of the important points about neighborliness, that, the sort of Judeo-Christian teachings on neighborliness. There's a line I use from Chesterton where he says, it's important that the biblical language speaks about the neighbor rather than love of humanity, because you have to love the sample of humanity that's actually given to you in this sort of concrete location, which is a much more serious occupation. Like, the sort of the famous example of like Mrs. Jellyby in Dickens' Bleak House, who's got telescopic eyes. She's neglecting her children while looking at these far off causes. And I think so part of it is just like acknowledging our concrete humanity, and that we have these deep needs to belong. We are part of a country. Now, I think for me, one of the challenges has been, I think America is so big. And I think when I was younger, I think I don't know, as like a young college person, you were just like, you have this sort of critical attitude, and like you see all the faults, and I think I've gotten more patriotic as I've gotten older. You sort of develop, it's imperfect, but like it's given me many great goods, and like who I am is shaped by being an American. Now, I've often have to process that more regionally. I think that's the way that I've come to my sort of like patriotism, or sense of affirmation of the American nation state as like a valuable ongoing project in democracy. Is that I don't I have a real populist sensibility as a Midwesterner. I think it just sort of comes naturally. I mean, one of my favorite sort of social critics is Christopher Lasch, who wrote this book, The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy. And he was born in Omaha, and like there's this sort of Midwestern sensibility. And so sometimes, these sort of, I mean, it's been easier to say, like, what I really love about America is that it's made possible my local, regional way of life, or the sort of the constitutional, the Constitution makes a way of life possible, right? And so, and patriotism has a connection with filial piety. Obviously, the patrios, it's the father, comes from root meanings for father, right? And so it has a sense of like, maybe part of why I'm drawn to that language myself is that it has that sense of a kind of reverence or filial piety, that you acknowledge the sort of sources of your existence. I mean, just like, like your parents, you don't expect everything to be perfect.
Sure.
But again, Chesterton has this line that I cite about, my country, right or wrong, is something no patriot would say. It'd be like saying my mother drunk or sober. Now, certainly you would share in your mother and her troubles and try to help her out in the same way, with someone who's patriotic or who wants to affirm the nation state. I do think that the cosmopolitan stance is a real, I mean, insofar as it denies patriotism, it's a denial of democracy. And so I think it's very problem. I mean, it's that we share something in common. I think solidarity, I mean, you can think of there's sort of like different sort of circles of solidarity. There's a sort of common human solidarity, but it's very appropriate, as you were saying, to have solidarity on the basis of other things that we share in common with people. For instance, being fellow citizens, being, members of the same state or, same local community, or being members of a family, or even friendship where you share certain deep common loves. And so I think all of that, those are legit, those are part of being human. And I think the attempt to, this is again where I think acknowledging limits is part of preserving what's noblest and best in our humanity. I think, we miss out on like crucially human goods, goods of friendship and family life and belonging to. I mean, part of the wonderful thing about, trying to love your country and your fellow citizens is that you disagree with them, but you're like, okay, we share in this thing together. And so we want to bring about the common good. We're probably going to disagree on what that means, but it unites you in a shared project that I think is crucially important. So that's why, I mean, I just think we are somewhere people. I mean, you could pretend like you're there are people who are very wealthy, or, it does tend to be among like academics. The positions I'm saying are not terribly popular. So I think we share a kind of like somewhat unpopular opinion in the sense of being stronger on a kind of like, whether you want to call it patriotism or nationalism, or healthy nationalism. I think, I do think it's of crucial importance. And I think without those sort of bonds of loyalty, I think it's very easy just for everything to be about you and to be selfish, and, like that you don't have any like demands to like work for the good of your country. Or, I don't want to paint, but I think there's a danger when you like, that's the danger of like having it just be completely abstract, is that, you don't have to recognize these bonds of attachment that are integral to, I think, a lot of people's lives and part of, living a flourishing human life. So, yeah, it sounds like we agree on this one. Or maybe just the terminological difference.
No. I do. Well, I'll just clarify a few things. But yes, I do think we mostly agree. My use of healthy nationalism is a type of reclaiming, right? Is a way to take the sting out of nationalism, because I read a lot about it, and I see, well, why is it always like just this, certain types of folks, take this word and it's such a dirty word, and like, I don't think inherently it's a dirty word. I think it has become that 100%. But I think I don't think inherently it is. So then I started looking more and more and more. And then I said, okay, well, it sounds like what's happening is it's just this very perverse, unhealthy type of nationalism that is othering other people or making, your countrymen superior to others. I'm not saying that at all. That's terrible. I think so. My idea is that this healthy nationalism is this kind of, how do you respect the kind of everything I just said earlier, is the culture and the norms and the rituals and the values, and I would 100% agree with you that in a sense, if you're doing kind of first kind of a sequential order, that starts with your local community, broadens out maybe to your wider district or county or whatever, and then your state, and then your country, and I think you can hold all of that at at the same time, right? We can hold four things at the same time. But I don't think it is one of these things where, obviously it's going to be within your kind of locus of control, right? I'm going to have more impact in, my small town and maybe my county here in the States than I would, on a national level, right? And in a way that kind of maps on and translates to, how we vote too, is local elections are always more important because that impacts you, right? Am I going to, vote for the person on school board to make sure, things are going right with the curriculum, or, with certain things with, is someone going to vote people on the county council that are going to fix my sidewalk when I need them to, stuff like that. That's probably more impactful. Not to say that, presidential elections and things like that aren't, but that's probably going to have more impact. So, so I think all of those things are helpful and important. And I do really like a lot of kind of localism kinds of stuff. I'm very sympathetic to that. But I do think that, I think kind of in general, having this kind of healthy sense of, belonging and nationalism and things like that, where it's not superior or inferior, it's not an othering of other groups of people. We should obviously welcome people into the country, but that there is a respect. And I think that's a two-way street of, if I've said this before, if I were to move to another country, I would be respectful of their history and their culture and their rituals and their norms. And I think that should be the same for the US. And I've written about this, but I think the difference with the US is that we are pretty fundamentally a country of immigrants in different waves and in different ways. And so that's a little bit of a different wrinkle there. So anyways, but we could go on more about that. I have taken so much of your time, David. So I don't want to, I feel bad. I don't want to take too much of your time.
No, we can wrap up soon. Yeah. But I would just affirm what you're saying. I mean, I think there's a lot of space between this sort of like tribalistic, chauvinistic nationalism and like this sort of deracinated cosmopolitan. I mean, both are kind of like ends of a spectrum. I think the middle ground is the right ground, but it's often more difficult to like, yes, we owe something to our fellow citizens, and we also owe something to our fellow human beings. Just like with our family, we owe something to our family, but that doesn't mean we don't have to care at all about our neighbors who aren't our family. And so, I mean, it's just how do you work out those tensions? It comes up in immigration. Like we should have some, we should be concerned with how it affects the working class in America. That like if it depresses wages and those sorts of things. But there are also cases of refugees who have dire need and that who come upon your shores and. Or people who are applying to come and they have cases of dire need or significant financial need, and so it's like practical wisdom. I mean, we can't get away. I mean, I think it's nice if we can pretend the world is simple and like have these like postured stances that like pretend everything's simple. But I think I think when we recognize the real obligations that we have, it's actually quite complicated to work out like what's the right policy decision. I think that if people realize that, though, I think it gives more like you can be more gracious in disagreement. You can say, I can understand how someone, this is a complicated issue. Someone of goodwill could come down on a different side, but it's much easier to make you feel much better about yourself. You demonize people. So again, I think we need a kind of greater solidarity and sense of civic friendship. I think that's sorely lacking. But
I firmly agree with you, and so I think that's super important. And I think having those types of conversations are hard, but I think super essential. So, it's been so much fun talking to you for the past couple hours. I really enjoyed it. In many ways, it feels like a warm up. There's so many other things I wanted to talk about too. So, but the book is called The Virtues of Limits. It's out now, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It's very, very thoughtful. I enjoyed it. And so where can people find the book, and where can they find you and your work and all the relevant places?
Yeah, so you can find my book on Amazon and most places books are sold. You can find it in Oxford. If you find me on Twitter, I posted we can get a discount. So it's in hardback right now. Nice. So academic books are typically sold in hardback to, at a little bit more expensive price. So libraries buy them and they can make back their costs. So it will also be coming out in paperback within the next year or two. Nice. So that will be at a much cheaper price. But so you can find, I have a discount code that I posted on Twitter and also on my website. You can go on there. If you just Google my name, David McPherson, philosopher, or Creighton, you should find me. So if you want to get that 30% discount. But yeah, Xavier, I just want to thank you for having me on. This was a lot of fun. I like some good back and forth and some.
Yes.
It's fun to agree sometimes, but it's also fun to have some productive disagreements. And so this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. And maybe we'll do it again here. And I feel like there's a lot of threads we could have gone for a long time. So. Yes.
That's typically how it works. It's one of those things where we just kind of have to wave to it as we pass by and come back to it at some other point. But I firmly agree with you. I found the conversation very invigorating in a lot of ways, and I think that it can be very helpful for people to kind of hear the conversation, be like, oh, I can hear both sides of this. And, maybe people will like your position or my position better, but, I'm not married to it. It's what I'm thinking now. I might be different 5 years from now. So, but I do think that was, really, really enjoyable for me at least. And so I can't say enough thanks to you for having the conversation.
Yeah, me too. It's great. So let's do it again.
All righty. Thanks.